Hey y'all, welcome back. That's right folks, it's that glorious time of the year when the census is finalized. Yay, hooray! Please clap along, I want to feel normal. So yeah, as of a few days ago, the broad findings of the census were released, meaning we now know which states are gonna gain or lose a couple House seats. And I physically cannot stress this enough to you viewers. The results of this census on their own could fundamentally shift the balance of power in Washington, D.C. for decades. With as important as these results are, I figured I'd take some time today to go over them with you, and we can talk about what's possible, what's likely, what's a long shot, you know, the whole shebang. So yeah, let's get to it. Also, I wanted to take a second to mention that as of today, Friday, April 30th, I'll be streaming to celebrate getting 2,000 subscribers, so if you're watching this on the day it drops, be sure to check me out this afternoon. I'll be playing some Minecraft and answering some questions, so be sure to come join us. And if you're watching this after the day of its release, fucking snooze you lose, I guess, loser. On top of that, the number of seats shifted and the states from which they shifted was the lowest since we started calculating our census in this way in 1941. So not only is our population growth somewhat stagnating, but it also seems our movement is slowing down a bit. But to the extent that people are moving around, it reflects the broader shift of people moving from the Rust Belt and parts of New England to the South and the West. In fact, though the shift is much less dire this time around than in 2010, we could see that same trend occurring where New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Illinois are all losing one, as states on the West Coast like Washington or the Southwest like Nevada, Arizona, Texas, some southern states like Florida are all gaining seats. And for the sake of debunking chucklefucks like Ted Cruz, it's impossible to ignore how a number of these shifts come from largely Republican strongholds and go to largely Democratic areas. But yeah, it is a bit weird to see how many of these states are every single year losing seats, namely New York, which seems to be on a consistent downturn lately. Speaking of New York, maybe the biggest tragedy of these results is the fact that New York lost a seat by 89 people. And I don't know, maybe I'm just built different, but it feels like a big shame to me that a difference of 89 people filling out the census is the difference between a state having a representative or not. Speaking of New York and the ramifications of these results, let's look at the results. In total, we have New York, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois, and West Virginia all losing a seat, which keeps in line with the trend we saw last decade. But we also have California losing a seat, which I don't think it's in this article, but I read somewhere else, is literally the first time in the state's history it's ever lost a seat. So, seems like a big deal to me. On the flip side, Montana, Oregon, Colorado, North Carolina, and Florida all gained 1 seat, and Texas gained 2. Want to give a quick shout out to Oregon. Love to see my psychedelic legalizing folks down there getting an extra state. We simply have to stand. And also shout out Montana. If you've never been to Montana, beautiful state, particularly the western mountainous regions. Lovely place to drive through. That sounds disrespectful, but it is nice. But the beauty of Montana's forestry is beside the point, because the most important question for today is how are all of these changes going to impact the midterms? The margin between the majority and minority party for this House of Representatives is one of the smallest it's been in decades. These numbers right here are a bit misleading, as many of these vacancies are just Democrats that are now in the Biden administration, with somebody about to be appointed or somebody about to be elected. So though the number here says 218, it's more accurate to operate off of 222. So with those numbers in mind, in order to get a majority in the House, the Republicans only need to flip like 5 seats. And bam, all of a sudden they've got a slim majority, but a majority nonetheless. Plus, if history serves as any sort of a guide, it is entirely likely that there will be a shift towards the opposition party in a president's first midterm. So all signs pointed to the Democrats' hold on the House of Representatives being in question even before we heard the census news. But with this census news, the essential question becomes, since the margin is so small, can Republicans gain a majority in the House purely from gerrymandering? Like if we re-rack the 2020 House elections and people turn out in the same numbers voting for the same party without question, can Republicans win not by appealing more to voters with any meaningful economic policy or backing off on their bigoted bullshit, but just by shifting boundaries around and stacking the deck in their favor? That is yet to be seen, as no states have set the districts since the data just came out on Monday, and they won't be able to start until the full regional data is available, which it won't be for a while. So while the full impact of these results won't be felt for a few months, we can now start to make some educated guesses. So let's move on to everyone's favorite activity, math. Okay, so let's take these states one by one. California. Since there are a few competitive but red-leaning districts in the greater LA suburbs area, I have a feeling the California Democratic Party will find a way to merge their boundaries so that essentially the Republicans lose a seat. Now that's not a guarantee because suburban voters are fickle and can sometimes turn on a dime based on minor details and like fucking tax policy and shit. But I do think it's safe to assume that that's a loss for Republicans. West Virginia. While it's definitely a loss of one for Republicans, I don't see a chance of either of these districts turning Democrat. You'd really have to be trying to screw yourself over if the state GOP hands the Democrats a seat. So I don't see a flip from this change, just a net loss. Ohio. It is such a gerrymandered state as is that the seat loss probably means -1 for the Democrats. Again, Ohio Republicans would have to try their hardest to give the Democrats a seat here. And with as crafty as they've proven to be to gerrymander Democrats out of seats, this strikes me as a very simple loss of a Democratic seat. Illinois. Though they lost a seat, the state Democratic Party just won a trifecta, so it's safe to assume that it'll be a loss for the GOP. Similar things can be said of New York, given that it's a Democratic stronghold, but I'm not quite as sold on this one. Some of the margins of districts upstate are razor thin. Plus, according to the study I was reading the other day, New York is the only state that favors its minority party in terms of federal representation. So I could easily see this seat being a Democratic loss or a Republican loss, so we'll call that a toss-up. On that note, Pennsylvania and Michigan are also toss-ups for me. While each has firm Republican control at the state level, the margins are pretty slim throughout. It's not an overwhelming majority. Plus, both states just voted for Biden in the election. Michigan elected a Democratic senator. Plus, one of them has a Democratic governor. So those really could go either way. I'll mark those both as toss-ups. Now those are the states that lost seats. Let's see who gained some. Oregon gained a seat, and while on its face that might look like a Democratic win, the state GOP caused such an obstructionist ruckus recently that the state Democratic Party let them have a say in the redistricting process, even though they didn't have the requisite numbers. You know, just to get them to stop stalling the function of governance as they're known to do. Plus, a few of these districts south of Portland are like within 10 points year to year, so with Republican influence and closer districts than you might otherwise expect, I actually think that's probably a seat pickup for Republicans. Montana. Now this could end up being one of the more interesting states out of the bunch. It votes heavier blue than people expect, like it has a Democratic senator, it just had a 2-term Democratic governor, and it's got enough big cities and Democratic-leaning areas that if the state-level GOP fucks around, they might find out and end up with a blue representative. However, my gut tells me that's a long shot, even if all the pieces are there, so I'm gonna mark that as a Republican pickup. Colorado's another interesting one. The state has a Democratic trifecta, but it's a fairly new blue state. So though I wouldn't be surprised if this turned into a Republican win, I'm gonna go with my gut and say the Democrats pick up a seat here. On its face, I'm tempted to say Florida and North Carolina would be easy dubs for the Republican Party, especially with as firmly conservative as Florida is getting. But I'm actually gonna put North Carolina in the toss-up camp. The margins were pretty close in 2020, and if it wasn't for a sex scandal, they might have elected a Democratic senator. So I'm going to tepidly say toss-up. Which leaves us with none other than Texas. If any of you are even remotely familiar with Texas's gerrymandering history, what with its oblong and onyx-shaped districts designed to dilute the largely POC vote of their big blue cities, it's pretty clear to me that this means Republicans gain 2 seats. If anyone can make some magic happen to stack the deck in their favor, it's Texas Republicans. So, if I'm doing my math right, that means Republicans can expect a net gain of 2 seats, with quite a few seats in the toss-up camp. So that certainly puts winning the House just through gerrymandering within reach for the Republican Party, but I wouldn't say that it's a guarantee. Again, a number of these districts are up in the air. But now that we've looked at the details, let's come back together and ask ourselves, what do we do with this information? A conclusion, if you will. In general, the point is Democrats need to keep their eye on the ball if they have any hope of retaining the House of Representatives. But at the same time, it's important to note this isn't a guaranteed loss. Outside of the possible gains through gerrymandering, almost all of the super close races in 2020 favored Republicans, so it's possible luck shifts and Democrats pick up a few more of those tight races next time, which could counterbalance some of the gerrymandered seats, and we might end up with the same margins and same majority as we have right now. But aside from those general predictions, let this be a moment to remind us all that it's kind of abysmal that state parties have so much influence through the sneaky practice that is gerrymandering. So much so that the whole balance of power in Washington, D.C., and quite literally for the future of this country, can shift the direction of politics, not based off any superior candidates or platforms that appeal to more people, just purely off of where they draw squiggly lines on a map. Honestly, kind of dystopian stuff, but what else can I expect from a dying empire like this one? And yeah, that's about it for today. Thanks for watching, everyone. Once again, if you're watching this on the day it releases, I will be streaming this afternoon, or at least my time zone is afternoon. For you, it might be the middle of the night. Come join us. I'll be playing some Minecraft, I'll be answering some questions, it'll be fun. Be sure to toss this video a like and subscribe down below, but if you really want to help me out, you can join me over on Patreon. Patrons get access to exclusive behind-the-scenes content, early versions of every video, and even some Patreon exclusive videos, like this Q&A or this segment talking about Cardi B and Dr. Seuss. Speaking of patrons, I want to give the biggest of thank yous to Piley Benton's biggest boys, like Nillik Elites, Sean Locke, Floof Pants, and Kerman Ferd. If you want to have your name read off at the end of every video, be sure to join me on this specific tier. Thanks much, everyone, and I'll see you next time.